They mocked her for being single at 40, until the Duke chose her and declared war on his own bloodline. The conservatory ballroom of Pemberton House blazed with 1,000 candles on that April evening in 1862, their light glittering off champagne flutes and diamond necklaces with equal brilliance. Beneath the soaring glass dome, where tropical palms cast shadows across the marble floor, 300 members of London's finest families waltzed and whispered and calculated the worth of every unmarried daughter in the room. Miss Anita Harrison stood near the third marble column from the musicians' gallery, a studied distance from both the dancing and the gossiping matrons, and practiced the art she had perfected over 20 years. The appearance of serene indifference to her own invisibility. "Poor creature," came the crystalline whisper from Lady Catherine's eldest daughter, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. 20 years on the marriage mart, and still she persists. One would think dignity alone would compel her retreat. Dignity? Another girl's laugh, bright and cruel as breaking glass. At 40, she's nothing but tragic determination in an olive gown. Anita's fingers tightened imperceptibly against her fan. She had learned not to flinch, not to grant them even that small satisfaction. Her auburn hair, arranged in simple waves that required neither the plumes nor jeweled combs of the younger women, caught the candlelight with copper fire. Her one remaining vanity in a world that had long since ceased to notice her. The olive-green gown she wore was well made, even elegant in its restraint, but it lacked the layers of tulle and embroidered silk that proclaimed youth and a father's deep pockets. It was, she knew, the dress of a woman whose prospects had quietly expired. She had attended this ball, as she attended every significant social event, not from hope, that dangerous delusion having been systematically strangled over 2 decades, but from sheer stubborn refusal to vanish entirely. If society insisted she was already a ghost, she would at least be a ghost who refused to haunt the margins in silence. The orchestra concluded a quadrille. In the brief pause before the next set, the conversational hum rose like a tide, carrying fragments of gossip and calculation across the perfumed air. Anita studied the Greek amphora displayed in the eastern alcove. It depicted Athena, goddess of wisdom, standing alone and armed, and permitted herself one bitter, silent observation. At least the goddess had chosen her solitude. Anita's had been chosen for her. One rejection, one passing season, one pitying glance at a time. Then the conservatory doors opened. The effect was immediate and absolute. Conversations stuttered into silence. Heads turned in a synchronized wave of curiosity and calculation. Even the musicians seemed to falter, their instruments producing one discordant note before recovering their rhythm. Richard Sebastian Taylor, Duke of Ashford, had arrived. He stood in the doorway like a portrait of aristocratic power made flesh, tall enough to command any room, broad-shouldered beneath a navy military-style coat that bore the elaborate gold braiding of his former cavalry rank. The coat fit him with the precision that only London's finest tailors could achieve, its high collar framing a strong jaw and the dark moustache that gave his handsome features an edge of severity. A tall black top hat sat at a precise angle, and his bearing carried the unconscious authority of a man who had never questioned his right to enter any space and dominate it. But it was not his appearance alone that caused the collective intake of breath. It was his reputation. For 15 years, since assuming his title at 23, the Duke of Ashford had been the most eligible and most elusive bachelor in England. Ambitious mothers had paraded their daughters before him at countless balls. Desperate fathers had arranged accidental encounters. Strategic hostesses had seated him beside every accomplished beauty in London. He had danced with precisely none of them more than once. He had proposed to absolutely none of them at all. The Ton had labelled him impossible, arrogant, too selective by half. Some whispered he harbored a secret engagement abroad. Others suggested his heart had been broken in his youth and never recovered. A few daring gossips implied darker explanations entirely. The truth, as Richard himself had once told his closest friend with characteristic bluntness, was far simpler. He found the entire marriage market to be an elaborate theatre of insincerity, and he had no intention of binding himself for life to an actress whose only skill was performing the role of ideal wife. Now he moved through the ballroom with the measured grace of a man who knew every eye tracked his progress. He acknowledged Lord Pemberton with a slight nod. He offered the Countess of Waverley the barest courtesy of a bow. His dark eyes swept across the assembled company with what appeared to be polite interest and was, in fact, profound indifference. Until his gaze found Anita. She saw the moment of recognition, though she could not have said what he recognized. She had never been introduced to the Duke of Ashford. She had never danced with him, never spoken to him, never moved in circles elevated enough to warrant his notice. Yet his eyes, a deep brown that the candlelight turned almost black, fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Then, impossibly, he began walking toward her. Anita's first coherent thought was that he must be heading toward someone behind her. She resisted the urge to turn and check, maintaining her position near the column through sheer force of will. The conversations around her had died completely now, replaced by a silence so profound she could hear the rustle of her own skirts, the too-fast rhythm of her own heart. The Duke stopped, directly before her. At close range, he was even more formidable, the breadth of his shoulders, the aristocratic planes of his face, the weight of absolute self-assurance that radiated from him like heat. She could see the gold threads in his coat's embroidery, each one a tiny declaration of wealth and status. She could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and leather. She could feel 300 pairs of eyes fixed upon this incomprehensible tableau. The most powerful bachelor in England, standing before the most overlooked spinster in London. He removed his hat. The gesture, old-fashioned, courtly, entirely unnecessary in a ballroom, sent a fresh ripple of shock through the assembled company. Hatless, his dark hair slightly disarranged, he looked less like an untouchable duke and more like a man. Then he bowed. Not the perfunctory nod he had offered Lady Pemberton, but a full, formal bow that belonged to an earlier, more gracious age. When he straightened, his eyes met hers directly. His voice when he spoke was deep and carried clearly in the preternatural silence. "Miss Harrison, I believe. Forgive my presumption in approaching without a proper introduction, but I find the conventions of polite society tedious at the best of times." His mouth quirked slightly, suggesting either humor or disdain. She could not determine which. "Would you do me the honor of joining me for the next waltz?" The world tilted on its axis. Somewhere behind her, a woman made a sound that might have been a gasp or might have been a strangled cry. A champagne flute struck marble and shattered, the sound sharp as gunfire in the silence. In the musicians' gallery, a violinist actually stopped playing, his bow suspended in mid-air as he stared at the scene unfolding below. Anita's mind, usually so quick and sharp, had gone utterly blank. This could not be happening. Dukes did not notice spinsters. Dukes certainly did not cross ballrooms to request dances from women whose social value had expired along with their youth. And yet here he stood, waiting for her answer with an expression of patient expectation, as though he had asked the most reasonable question in the world. "I?" Her voice emerged as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, desperate not to humiliate herself further in front of the entire ton. "Your Grace, I believe you may be mistaken. We have not been introduced, and I am certainly not. You are Miss Anita Marion Harrison, aged 40, daughter of the late Mr. James Harrison of Yorkshire, sister to Mr. Thomas Harrison of Bedford Square, accomplished reader of classical literature, and possessor of what I am reliably informed is the most extensive personal collection of art history volumes in London. His recitation was precise, almost clinical, yet his eyes held something that looked almost like amusement. You attend every major ball but dance with no one. You volunteer at St. Anne's Hospital on Tuesdays. And you prefer the British Museum's Greek galleries to any other entertainment London has to offer. Have I been misinformed? Anita felt the blood drain from her face. He had inquired about her. The Duke of Ashford had made inquiries about her life, her habits, her interests. The impossibility of it threatened to buckle her knees. You have not been misinformed, she managed, her voice steadier now despite the chaos in her mind, though I cannot fathom why such unremarkable details would be of interest to your grace. Then allow me to clarify my interest through action rather than explanation. He extended his hand, gloved in supple black leather. The waltz, Miss Harrison. Unless you wish to refuse me and provide this assembly with even more dramatic entertainment than my request has already supplied. His tone carried a hint of challenge now, as though he were daring her to do precisely that, to refuse him in front of 300 witnesses and confirm that she possessed the audacity to match his own. Anita looked at his extended hand. She looked at his face, trying to read mockery in his expression and finding only an unwavering intensity. She felt the weight of every eye in the ballroom boring into her back, heard the whispers beginning to rise like a gathering storm. This was madness. This was social suicide, or worse, an elaborate form of public humiliation she did not yet understand. But God help her. When would she ever receive another such offer? When would any man, let alone a duke, ever look at her again with anything other than pity or dismissal? She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising warmth, solid and real and utterly undeniable. He led her toward the center of the ballroom floor as the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses, their faces a blur of shock and scandal and barely suppressed glee at the spectacle unfolding. The orchestra, recovering from their collective stupor, began the opening strains of a Viennese waltz. The Duke's hand settled at her waist. Her hand rose to his shoulder, feeling the solid muscle beneath the elaborate coat. They stood poised in the opening position as gasps and whispers erupted around them like wildfire catching dry grass. Then he smiled at her. A real smile. Not the polite grimace she had seen him offer others, but something genuine and conspiratorial. I suggest you breathe, Miss Harrison, he murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. We are about to give London something to talk about for the next decade. And then they began to dance, and the impossible became inescapably, irrevocably real. The Duke moved with a grace that stunned her. She had expected competence. Men of his rank were trained in such things. But not this fluid certainty, this effortless command of rhythm and space. His hand at her waist was firm without being presumptuous, guiding her through the turns with a confidence that made even her rusty steps feel almost elegant. Anita was acutely conscious of every eye fixed upon them, of the way conversations had ceased entirely, replaced by the frantic whisper of fans and the sharp intake of scandalized breath. "You're trembling," he observed quietly, his voice carrying no judgment, merely statement of fact. 300 people are watching us, Your Grace, she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. Forgive me if I find that somewhat unnerving. Then let them watch. His eyes never left her face, as though the assembled aristocracy of London had ceased to exist entirely. Tell me, Miss Harrison, what were you thinking about before I approached? And please don't insult my intelligence by claiming you were admiring the flowers. The unexpectedness of the question steadied her somehow. I was studying the amphora in the alcove, the depiction of Athena. Ah, wisdom over beauty, intellect over ornament. Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. How refreshingly appropriate. You are, I believe, the only woman present who appears to be thinking rather than merely performing. Around them, the ballroom had transformed into a theatre of shock. Lady Pemberton stood frozen near the refreshment table, her face pale as parchment, one hand pressed to her chest as though checking her heart still beat. The young debutantes clustered in horrified fascination, their carefully cultivated smiles replaced by expressions of pure bewilderment. How could the impossible Duke choose the invisible spinster? What hidden calculation had they failed to perceive? Beside the musicians' gallery, the Dowager Countess of Essex clutched her fan so tightly the ivory stays cracked audibly. Gentlemen exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to something approaching reluctant admiration. The Duke had always done exactly as he pleased, but this exceeded even his reputation for defying expectation. "Your Grace," Anita said carefully, "I must confess I do not understand your purpose here." "My purpose is to dance with the most interesting woman in this ballroom." He executed a flawless turn, the gold braiding on his coat catching the candlelight. "I find that purpose self-explanatory." The waltz ended far too quickly and far too slowly, time behaving with the elastic unreliability of dreams. When the final notes faded, the Duke bowed with the same formal courtesy he had shown at the beginning, as though nothing remarkable had occurred. "Thank you, Miss Harrison. You have made this evening considerably less tedious than I anticipated." Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, moving toward the card room with the same unhurried authority that had brought him to her side. Anita stood alone in the center of the ballroom floor, feeling stripped bare beneath the weight of 300 stares. Thomas materialized at her elbow within moments, his pleasant features drawn tight with concern. Her brother, always protective, always worried, took her arm, with a gentleness that suggested she might shatter. "Anita," he said quietly, steering her toward the conservatory doors and blessed escape. "What in God's name just happened?" "I have no idea," she whispered. "The Duke of Ashford is powerful, yes, but he is also ruthless. Kindness has never been numbered among his virtues." Thomas's grip tightened fractionally. "Whatever game he's playing, I fear you may be the pawn, not the player." The carriage ride home passed in merciful silence, Thomas having learned long ago when his sister needed solitude rather than comfort. Anita sat in the darkness, watching the London streets blur past the window, and allowed herself one dangerous, foolish moment. What if it had been real? What if the Duke's interest, however inexplicable, had been genuine? Hope fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird, fragile and frantic. Then she crushed it ruthlessly, the way she had learned to crush such feelings over 20 years of systematic disappointment. She was 40 years old, long past the age of romantic delusion. Whatever the Duke's purpose, it could not be honest courtship. Men like him did not choose women like her. To believe otherwise was the foolishness of a desperate woman who should have learned better long ago. By the time the carriage reached Bedford Square, Anita had locked the hope away in the deepest chamber of her heart, where it could do no further damage. The morning shattered that resolution, with the subtlety of cannon fire. Anita was taking breakfast in the small dining room when the commotion began. Raised voices in the entrance hall, the housekeeper's shocked exclamation, the sound of furniture being hastily rearranged. Then Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression hovering between astonishment and alarm. "Anita, you need to see this." The arrangement dominated the entrance hall like a crimson monument to excess. Roses, dozens upon dozens of them, their blooms so dark they appeared almost burgundy in the morning light, spilled from an enormous crystal vase that required 2 footmen to stabilize. The scent was overwhelming, decadent, utterly unmistakable. Every servant in the household had found reason to hover nearby, their eyes wide with speculation. The card, cream-colored and bearing an embossed ducal crest, sat propped against the vase. Anita's hands shook as she opened it. The message was brief, written in a bold, masculine hand. "With admiration, R.S.T." "Good God," Thomas breathed. "The entire street witnessed the delivery. This will be in every drawing room in London by tea time." Catherine swept into the hall, her morning dress rustling with agitation. Thomas's wife possessed a shrewd understanding of society's mechanisms, and the expression she wore now was pure calculation, tinged with concern. "Anita, darling, we must speak frankly." Catherine drew her into the morning room, closing the door against curious ears. "The Duke of Ashford has a formidable reputation. He is powerful, certainly, but he is also known for his singular approach to entertainment. Some gentlemen make wagers, you understand. Cruel wagers about impossible conquests." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What if this attention is mockery disguised as courtship? What if you are being made sport of before all of London?" The words struck like physical blows, each one landing precisely where Anita's own doubts had already carved out space. She had thought the same thing, feared it with every fiber of her being. To voice it aloud made it somehow more real, more probable. "I don't know," Anita admitted quietly. "I don't know anything anymore." 3 days of escalating gossip passed before Anita could bear the scrutiny no longer. She fled to the British Museum, that sanctuary of marble and ancient artifacts where society's cruelties felt mercifully distant. The Greek galleries were blessedly empty on a Wednesday afternoon, and she lost herself in studying the red figure amphora that depicted Athena in full armor, spear raised, owl perched upon her shoulder. "The goddess of wisdom." The Duke's voice came from directly behind her, causing her to start violently, armed and alone, but never diminished by either condition. He stood there in a charcoal coat and ivory cravat, looking entirely too elegant for a museum visit, his dark eyes fixed upon her with that same unsettling intensity. "Your Grace," she managed, her heart racing. "I did not expect—" "Few people expect me anywhere, which is precisely why I go where I please." He moved to stand beside her, studying the amphora with apparent genuine interest. "Athena rejected marriage and motherhood, you know. She chose instead to be defined by her intellect and her strength. Society called her a virgin goddess, but I suspect that was merely their way of dismissing a woman who refused their prescribed role." "A radical interpretation," Anita said carefully. "Perhaps. Or perhaps simply an honest one." He turned to face her fully. "Tell me, Miss Harrison, do you believe wisdom requires the validation of beauty to have value?" Before she could answer, voices echoed from the adjoining gallery. Lady Peaton swept into view, her 2 daughters flanking her like decorative sentries. The woman's eyes widened at the sight of the Duke, then narrowed when they landed on Anita. "How extraordinary," Lady Peaton drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "One does encounter the most unexpected people in public spaces. Though I suppose some women will cling to any attention from their betters, regardless of how unsuitable the circumstances." The temperature in the gallery seemed to drop 10 degrees. The Duke turned slowly, and Anita watched his expression transform from mild interest to something cold and cutting as winter steel. "Lady Peton," his voice could have frozen champagne, "I was unaware you possessed sufficient education to appreciate classical antiquities, though I suppose even limited intellects occasionally stumble into museums." He paused, letting the insult land. "Miss Harrison, however, possesses a genuine understanding of Hellenic culture and mythology that I have found both rare and refreshing. A mind capable of genuine thought is rarer than 10 dozen simpering debutantes who can barely distinguish Athena from Aphrodite." Lady Peton's face flushed scarlet. Her daughters looked as though they wished the marble floor would open and swallow them. Without another word, the 3 women retreated, their exit swift and humiliated. Anita stood frozen, scarcely daring to breathe. The Duke had just publicly defended her before one of London's most influential gossips. The implications were staggering. He returned his attention to the amphora as though nothing remarkable had occurred. "Now, Miss Harrison, you were about to share your thoughts on whether wisdom requires beauty's validation. I find myself genuinely curious about your answer. And despite everything, the fear, the doubt, the certainty that this would end in heartbreak, Anita found herself answering honestly." Richard Sebastian Taylor poured 2 glasses of brandy in the book-lined sanctuary of his study and handed one to the man sprawled in the leather chair opposite. Lord Marcus Hartwell had been his closest friend since their days at Cambridge, which meant Marcus was one of perhaps 3 people in England who dared speak to him with complete honesty. "So," Marcus said, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully, "Miss Anita Harrison, the entire city is talking about nothing else. Tell me this is serious, Richard, because if you're playing games with that woman's reputation, I'll call you out myself." "It's serious." Richard settled into his own chair, the weight of the words surprising even himself with their certainty. "Absolutely serious." "Good God. You're actually considering marriage." Marcus sat forward, genuine shock, replacing his usual sardonic amusement. "After 15 years of rejecting every eligible woman in the kingdom, you've chosen a 40-year-old spinster with no fortune and no connections. Forgive me, but I need to understand why." "Because she doesn't flutter or flatter. Because when I speak to her, I'm conversing with an actual mind rather than a performance designed to entrap me." Richard took a long drink, feeling the brandy burn pleasantly. "Because she expects nothing from me. No performance, no pretense. She doesn't simper or calculate or angle for advantage. Do you have any idea how rare that is, how exhausting it becomes to be perpetually on display, perpetually assessed as a title rather than a man? So this is about your comfort." Marcus's tone held a note of challenge. "No. This is about finding someone genuine in a world constructed entirely of artifice." Richard met his friend's eyes directly. "I'm 38 years old, Marcus. I've attended 1,000 balls, danced with 500 women who all looked at me and saw only the Duke of Ashford, the coronet, the estates, the income. Miss Harrison looked at me and saw a man who might have something to say worth hearing. That is worth more than a dozen debutantes with impeccable pedigrees and empty heads." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then raised his glass in a quiet salute. "Then I wish you joy of it." though I suspect society will make you pay dearly for such an unconventional choice. Society and its petty rules can go hang, Richard said with quiet intensity. I've played by their rules long enough. 3 days later, he presented his card at the Harrison townhouse in Bedford Square and requested formally to call upon Miss Harrison. The butler showed him to the drawing room where Anita waited, her hands folded in her lap with a precision that betrayed her nervousness. She wore a day dress of deep blue that brought out the warmth in her hazel eyes, and her auburn hair was arranged simply, without artifice. She did not pretend at ease. She did not flutter or smile coquettishly. She simply looked at him with those expressive eyes and asked the question that had clearly been tormenting her. Why? Her voice was steady, despite the tremor he could see in her hands. Why did you single me out, Your Grace? I have spent 3 sleepless nights trying to comprehend your purpose, and I can arrive at no rational explanation. So I am asking you plainly, what is your intention? If this is mockery, I would prefer you deliver the punchline now and spare me further humiliation. The raw honesty of it struck him like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had been so systematically dismissed that she could not even conceive of genuine interest. The cruelty of it, of what society had done to her, made him want to burn down every ballroom in London. He moved to sit across from her, maintaining a respectful distance, but leaning forward so she could see his face clearly, read the sincerity there. Miss Harrison, Anita, if I may, I singled you out because you are a beacon of authenticity in a world drowning in pretense. He watched her eyes widen, saw her breath catch. Because when you looked at me during that waltz, you saw a man, not a duke. You saw someone who might be worth conversing with, not someone to be conquered or displayed as a trophy. Because in 15 years, and countless ballrooms filled with women who were younger, richer, more conventionally beautiful, you are the first woman whose company I can envision not merely tolerating, but cherishing for a lifetime. The silence that followed was absolute. Anita stared at him as though he had spoken in ancient Greek, as though the words required translation into some language she could comprehend. You cannot possibly mean that, she whispered. I assure you, I have never been more serious about anything in my entire life. He held her gaze, willing her to believe. I am pursuing you, Miss Harrison, because you have engaged my mind and captured my interest in ways no other woman has managed in 38 years. And I would very much like to continue pursuing you, if you will permit it. A single tear traced down her cheek. She did not brush it away. I don't understand this, she said softly. But I find myself wanting desperately to believe it might be real. Then believe it, Richard said simply, and give me the chance to prove it to you. He did not allow her time to retreat into doubt. He pressed forward with the directness that had served him well in every other arena of his life, though never before in matters of the heart. I should be clear about my intentions, Miss Harrison. I am not proposing a casual flirtation or an ambiguous friendship. I wish to court you formally, with the express purpose of pursuing a more permanent arrangement. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle between them. I am speaking of marriage. Anita's face went pale, then flushed with color. Your Grace, you cannot. I am 40 years old. I have no dowry to speak of, no connections of value, no— Stop. The command was gentle but absolute. Those are the remarkably shallow criteria of remarkably shallow minds, and I will not hear you diminish yourself with such nonsense. Your age is a mark of experience and wisdom, not deficiency. Your lack of fortune means you could not possibly be pursuing me for mercenary reasons. and your so-called lack of connections means you come unburdened by the tedious obligations that accompany every ambitious family in London. But surely my family will adjust their expectations to match my choice, or they will find themselves considerably less involved in my life. His tone carried the finality of a man accustomed to having his decisions respected. I am not seeking their approval, Miss Harrison. I am seeking yours. The door to the drawing-room opened without warning. Mrs. Eleanor Harrison swept in with the proprietary air of a woman who considered every room in the house her domain, regardless of whether she had been invited. She was a handsome woman in her 60s, dressed in expensive lavender silk, and her expression upon seeing the Duke shifted rapidly from surprise to calculating interest. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure." She barely glanced at her daughter. "I do hope Anita has not been boring you with her peculiar interests. She has such an unfortunate disposition, always reading when she should be more mindful of company, and her regrettable lack of charm. Well, I have tried, but some deficiencies simply cannot be overcome." The change in Richard was instantaneous. He rose to his full height, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. When he spoke, his voice carried the cutting precision of a blade, sliding between ribs. "Madam, I find your assessment of your daughter to be so profoundly inaccurate that I must question whether you have ever truly observed her at all." Each word was enunciated with devastating clarity. Miss Harrison possesses an intellect that puts most of London's so-called educated gentlemen to shame. Her character is defined by dignity, resilience, and an authenticity that is vanishingly rare in our society. Her lack of charm, as you so dismissively phrase it, is in fact a refusal to engage in the simpering artifice that passes for feminine accomplishment among women half her age. Mrs. Harrison's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Richard turned his back on her, a deliberate, aristocratic dismissal that transformed her into irrelevant furniture, and addressed Anita as though they were entirely alone. "Miss Harrison, I would be honored if you would join me for a promenade at Kew Gardens tomorrow afternoon. Say, 2 o'clock. I believe the spring blooms are particularly magnificent this year, and I should very much enjoy your thoughts on the botanical arrangements." The invitation was public courtship in its most unmistakable form. Kew Gardens on a Saturday afternoon would be crowded with fashionable society. They would be seen by hundreds. The statement would be absolute. Anita's eyes darted to her mother, then back to Richard. He watched her spine straighten, watched her lift her chin with something approaching defiance. "I would be delighted, Your Grace." "Excellent." He allowed himself a small smile, one that transformed his severe features into something warmer. "I shall call for you at 1:30. That will give us time to arrive when the gardens are at their most populated." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "I find I am eager for all of London to see us together." He bowed formally to Anita, nodded with cool dismissal toward her mother, and departed, leaving behind a silence that felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Mrs. Harrison recovered her voice first. "Anita, you cannot possibly think—" "I think," Anita interrupted, her voice steady and stronger than Richard had yet heard it, "that I will wear my blue walking dress tomorrow, the one with the ivory trim." And for the first time in 20 years, she smiled with something approaching genuine hope. The afternoon sun transformed Kew Gardens into a cathedral of light and color. Cherry blossoms drifted like pink snow across the manicured paths, and the air carried the perfume of 1,000 spring flowers. It was, as Richard had accurately predicted, crowded with London's fashionable set, ladies in pastel walking dresses, gentlemen in crisp morning coats, all of them ostensibly admiring the botanical displays, while actually surveying one another with the predatory attention of hawks. The arrival of the Duke of Ashford's carriage caused heads to turn like compass needles finding north. When he handed Miss Anita Harrison down from the vehicle, her blue walking dress with ivory trim catching the sunlight, the whispers began immediately. They rippled through the crowd, like wind through wheat, carrying scandal and speculation in equal measure. Richard offered his arm with deliberate formality. Anita took it, her hand trembling only slightly against his sleeve. He could feel her awareness of every eye fixed upon them, but he kept his own gaze forward, projecting the absolute confidence that came from 38 years of having society arrange itself around his preferences. "They're staring," she murmured as they began their promenade down the main avenue. "Let them stare. I find I am entirely unconcerned with their opinions." He guided her past a bed of crimson tulips, noting absently how the color echoed the roses he had sent. "Tell me, Miss Harrison, do you know what society calls women of your age who remain unmarried?" She stiffened slightly. "I am well acquainted with the terminology, Your Grace. Spinsters, on the shelf, past their bloom." He said each phrase with increasing contempt. "The entire concept is both arbitrary and idiotic, as though a woman's value expires like milk left too long in the sun. As though wisdom, experience, and depth of character count for nothing against the supposed virtue of being young and malleable. Society believes youth and beauty are what men desire," Anita said quietly. "Society believes many foolish things. That doesn't make them true." They rounded a corner into a more secluded path lined with wisteria, the purple blooms hanging like jeweled curtains. He stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "May I be frank with you? I would prefer it, actually. Pretense exhausts me." Something in his chest tightened at that admission. She understood then the bone-deep weariness of performing. He took her hand, a bold gesture in so public a space, and felt her fingers curl tentatively around his. "I am pursuing you, Miss Harrison, because you have engaged my mind and intrigued my heart in ways no other woman has managed in 38 years. Not despite your 40 years, but perhaps because of the wisdom and authenticity those years have granted you." His voice dropped to quiet intensity. "Those girls barely out of the schoolroom, the ones society deems so desirable. They are decorative and trained to please, but they have no substance. They have not lived enough to know who they truly are beneath the performance. You know exactly who you are. That knowledge, that self-possession, it is worth more than a dozen debutantes with perfect complexions and empty heads." A couple passed them on the path, Lord and Lady Westbrook, their eyes widening at the sight of the Duke holding Miss Harrison's hand. Richard did not release her. If anything, his grip tightened slightly, a public declaration that he was entirely unashamed of this connection. "Your Grace," Anita began, her voice unsteady. "Richard, when we are alone, or as alone as one can be in Kew Gardens on a Saturday, I would prefer you call me Richard." "Richard." She tested the name carefully, as though it might shatter if spoken too loudly. "I don't understand what I have done to deserve this attention, but I find I no longer wish to question it quite so relentlessly." "Good, because I have every intention of escalating this attention considerably." He resumed their walk, tucking her hand more securely against his arm. "I would like to invite you to dine with my closest friends next Thursday evening. Lord Hartwell and his wife, Sir James Pemberton and Lady Catherine. Intimate company, intelligent conversation, No performative nonsense. I would be honored. And within the fortnight, I would like you to meet my family. A formal dinner at Ashford House. He felt her tense immediately, and continued before she could voice objection. I will not pretend they will welcome you warmly. My mother is formidable. My brother is a pompous fool. But they will meet you because I require it, and because you are the woman I intend to marry. Anita stopped walking so abruptly she nearly stumbled. You cannot say such things so casually. I assure you there is nothing casual about it. He steadied her with his free hand, aware that they had become the center of attention for at least 30 onlookers. I am making my intentions devastatingly clear, Miss Harrison. To you, to my family, and most importantly, to all of London. You are not a passing fancy. You are the woman I choose. Tears gathered in her eyes, catching the afternoon light. Why? She whispered. Why me? Because, he said simply, you are the only woman I have ever met who makes me believe that marriage might be something other than a tedious obligation. You make me believe it could be a partnership worth having. Around them, the gardens blazed with spring's impossible beauty. But Richard saw only her face and the dawning hope written there. The dinner at Lord Hartwell's townhouse proved surprisingly effortless. Lady Hartwell, a sharp-witted woman with kind eyes, engaged Anita in a spirited discussion about the merits of Gothic versus Romanesque architecture. Sir James Pemberton challenged her views on agricultural reform, only to concede several points by evening's end. By the time dessert arrived, Anita had won their genuine respect, and Richard watched with quiet satisfaction as his closest friends recognized what he had seen from the first. Here was a woman of substance. She's extraordinary, Marcus murmured as the ladies withdrew to the drawing room. If you let her slip away, I'll question your sanity. But Ashford House was a different battlefield entirely. The formal dining room gleamed with centuries of accumulated wealth, crystal chandeliers, portraits of stern ancestors, silver that had served 20 generations of tailors. The Dowager Duchess sat at the table's head like a monarch on a throne, her black silk gown and jet jewelry proclaiming her permanent widowhood. She was a handsome woman in her 60s, with iron-grey hair and eyes that could freeze champagne. She greeted Anita with the barest civility protocol demanded. Miss Harrison, how unexpected to make your acquaintance. James Taylor, Richard's younger brother, abandoned even that pretense of courtesy. He was 35, fair-haired and weak-chinned, a man whose only accomplishment was being born second to a dukedom. This is absurd, James announced before the first course arrived. Forgive my bluntness, Miss Harrison, but one must question what you hope to gain from this association. Surely you understand that a match between yourself and my brother is wildly unsuitable. James. Richard's voice carried a warning that would have silenced a wiser man. No, Richard, this must be said. The woman is 40 years old, without fortune or family of consequence. What possible reason could she have for encouraging your attention, except mercenary calculation? Anita's face had gone pale, but she held herself with remarkable dignity. Richard felt rage building in his chest like a gathering storm. Perhaps, the Dowager said coldly, you might explain to Miss Harrison that the Ashford name carries certain obligations, standards that must be maintained. A duchess requires breeding, connections, the ability to navigate society with grace. Not merely, her gaze swept dismissively over Anita, adequate literacy and a few museum visits. The room seemed to contract around Richard's fury. He set down his wine-glass with such precision it rang like a bell. "You will not speak of her that way." "Richard, be reasonable," his mother began. "No." He rose to his full height, and the dining room felt suddenly too small to contain him. "You will not speak of her with contempt. You will not question her character or her motives, and you will certainly not dictate whom I choose to marry. This unsuitable infatuation will destroy everything we have built." The dowager's voice rose sharply. "Then let it burn." Richard's words fell like hammer blows. "I have spent 15 years enduring your matchmaking schemes, your parade of vapid debutantes, your tiresome insistence that I marry for bloodlines and alliances. I have given you patience. I have given you courtesy, but I will not give you this. Miss Harrison is the woman I have chosen, and if my family cannot accept that choice, then I will consider myself no longer bound by your expectations." "You cannot mean that," James sputtered. "The family name—" "I would rather renounce the Ashford name than renounce Miss Harrison." The declaration was absolute, final, irrevocable. "Choose your next words very carefully, because they will determine whether you remain part of my life." The silence was deafening. The Dowager Duchess looked as though she had been struck. James's face had gone scarlet. Richard turned to Anita, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and offered his arm. "Come. I believe we've endured sufficient hospitality for one evening." He led her from the dining room, through the marble halls, into the garden where moonlight silvered the roses. Only when they were alone did he release her arm and take both her hands in his. "Forgive them. Forgive me for subjecting you to that cruelty." "You defended me," she whispered. "You chose me over your family. I chose you over everything." He dropped to one knee, there in the moonlit garden, and looked up at her tear-stained face. "Anita Marion Harrison, I am asking you to be my wife. Not because society demands it, not because my family approves. They clearly don't. But because I cannot envision my life without you in it. Will you marry me?" "I am 40 years old," she said, her voice breaking. "I have nothing to offer you, but you have everything I need: intelligence, honesty, a mind I respect, and a presence I cherish. Say yes." The tears spilled over then, tracking silver down her cheeks. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I will marry you." He rose and pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she was something precious and hard-won. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessing a choice that would reshape 2 lives forever. The announcement appeared in the Times on a grey Tuesday morning, 9 words that detonated like artillery across London's drawing rooms. The Duke of Ashford to wed Miss Anita Harrison. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Matrons who had spent 15 years angling to secure the Duke for their daughters went into mourning as though someone had died. The betting books at White's erupted into chaos as gentlemen scrambled to settle wagers they had never imagined would come due. At 3 separate afternoon teas, ladies fainted, though whether from genuine shock or theatrical opportunity remained unclear. The Dowager Duchess issued a terse statement declining to attend the wedding, citing ill health that no one believed. James Taylor proved far less circumspect, spreading rumors through his club that Miss Harrison had somehow entrapped his brother, that there must be hidden fortune or scandalous secrets to explain such an inexplicable match. His suggestions grew increasingly vicious. Perhaps she had threatened blackmail. Perhaps the Duke had been compromised by some feminine stratagem too indelicate to name. Half of London society cut Anita entirely. Invitations ceased to arrive at Bedford Square. Former acquaintances suddenly failed to recognize her on the street. Lady Pemberton went so far as to cancel a charitable luncheon rather than risk Anita's attendance. The other half watched with fascinated horror, unable to look away from the spectacle. Some grudgingly admired the Duke's audacity. Others predicted disaster with grim certainty. All of them waited to see whether this impossible match would endure or collapse under the weight of society's disapproval. Richard remained utterly unmoved by all of it. He declined his mother's attempts at reconciliation, returned James's letters, unopened, and ignored the whispered speculation entirely. When the Archbishop of Canterbury suggested a grand ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, befitting a duke's wedding, Richard politely but firmly refused. "We will marry at St. Margaret's," he told Anita one afternoon in the Harrison drawing room. "A smaller church, intimate, with only those who genuinely wish us well in attendance. I have no desire to transform our marriage into a spectacle for people who spent years dismissing you and now suddenly claim interest." "Your family," she began, "has made their position clear. I will not beg them to witness what they cannot support." His voice softened. "This day belongs to us, Anita, not to society's expectations or my family's disappointment, just us." The morning of her wedding, Anita woke before dawn, her heart racing with emotions she could barely name. Catherine helped her dress in the gown they had commissioned, ivory silk with delicate lace at the sleeves, elegant in its simplicity, nothing like the elaborate confections debutantes wore. As her sister-in-law fastened the last button, a knock came at the door. Thomas entered, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "From the Duke. He asked that I deliver it before the ceremony." Inside, Anita found a leather-bound journal, its pages creamy and blank, waiting to be filled. Tucked within the first page was an envelope containing tickets. Passage for 2 to Florence, with additional arrangements for Rome and Venice. The itinerary was meticulous: the Uffizi Gallery, the Sistine Chapel, St. Mark's Basilica, every museum and cathedral she had ever mentioned in passing. A note, in Richard's bold hand, accompanied them. "My dearest Anita, you once told me, during our second visit to the British Museum, that you had spent your life reading about Renaissance masterpieces, but had long ago accepted you would never see them yourself. You said it with such quiet resignation that it broke something in me. Consider this acceptance revoked. We depart for Florence 3 days after the wedding. The journal is for your observations, your sketches, your thoughts on seeing the art you have studied for so long. I confess I am selfishly eager to experience these treasures through your eyes, to hear your insights as we stand before works you have only known through books. This is merely the first of many dreams I intend to help you reclaim. Yours, in anticipation of our shared adventure, Richard." The tears came then, hot and overwhelming, smudging the ink slightly where they fell. Catherine embraced her quickly, murmuring soothing words, but Anita barely heard them. She was thinking of Renaissance frescoes bathed in Italian sunlight, of standing beside the man who had chosen her in front of Botticelli's Venus, of a future that had seemed impossible mere weeks ago. "He remembered," she whispered. "Every word. He remembered everything." "Of course he did," Catherine said gently. "He loves you." It was the first time anyone had said it aloud, and the truth of it settled into Anita's bones like warmth after long cold. Richard loved her, not despite her 40 years or her unremarkable circumstances, but because of who she was beneath all of society's shallow measurements. She pressed the journal to her chest and smiled through her tears. In a few hours, she would walk down the aisle toward the man who had looked past invisibility and seen her. The man who had declared war on his own bloodline, rather than surrender what they had found together. "I'm ready," Anita said. "Let's go to the church." The afternoon sun poured through the stained glass windows of St. Margaret's Church, transforming the small sanctuary into a jewel box of colored light. It was a golden day in May, warm and luminous, as though the world itself had conspired to celebrate what society had condemned. The guests numbered perhaps 40, Lord and Lady Hartwell, Sir James and Lady Catherine, Thomas and his family, and a carefully curated assembly of those who had proven themselves genuine. Conspicuously absent were the Dowager Duchess, James Taylor, and the legion of fashionable Londoners who would have demanded invitations to a ducal wedding. Their absence was not mourned. The organ began its processional, and Anita started down the aisle on Thomas's arm. Her gown of ivory silk caught the light with each step, its simple elegance a perfect reflection of the woman wearing it. Nothing excessive, nothing false, just beauty in its most honest form. Her auburn hair was dressed with small white roses, and she carried a bouquet of the same crimson blooms Richard had sent that first morning. She saw him waiting at the altar, and her breath caught. He wore formal black with a silver waistcoat, his dark hair perfectly arranged, but it was his expression that undid her. Undisguised devotion, as though she were the only woman who had ever existed, as though this moment had been inevitable from the first waltz. When Thomas placed her hand in Richard's, she felt the tremor in his fingers, the evidence that even the unshakable Duke was not immune to emotion. They turned together to face the vicar, and the ancient words began. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Anita barely heard the liturgy. She was too conscious of Richard's hand gripping hers, of his voice when he spoke his vows, steady and clear and absolutely certain. When her turn came, she found her own voice stronger than she had dared hope. "I, Anita Marion Harrison, take thee, Richard Sebastian Taylor." The words bound them together, transformed them from separate souls into something united. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, Richard turned to her with such tenderness in his eyes that she felt tears threaten. "May I kiss my wife?" he asked softly, as though requesting permission for something sacred. She nodded, unable to speak, and he leaned down to press his lips to hers. The kiss was tender and certain, a promise and a claiming both, and when he drew back, he whispered against her forehead, "My Duchess, my Anita." The wedding breakfast was held at the Hartwell residence, intimate and joyous. As dessert was served, Marcus rose with his glass raised, his expression unusually solemn. "To the Duke and Duchess of Ashford," he declared, his voice carrying clearly. "May your courage in choosing truth over convention inspire us all. May your defiance of shallow expectations remind us what truly matters. And may your marriage be blessed with all the happiness two people of such remarkable character deserve." The glasses rose as one, the toast echoing through the room. Anita looked around at these faces, genuine friendship, honest affection, the kind of regard that could not be purchased or performed. This was what mattered, not the 300 who had gasped at their first waltz, but these 40 who had chosen to witness their union with joy rather than judgment. 3 days later, they stood at the rail of a ship bound for Italy, watching the English coast recede into mist and memory. The sea wind tugged at Anita's traveling cloak, and Richard's arm circled her waist, holding her steady against the deck's gentle roll. She was no longer Miss Harrison, the invisible spinster who haunted ballroom margins. She was the Duchess of Ashford, A woman who had learned that authentic love was worth declaring war for. A woman who had been seen, truly seen, and chosen anyway. No, not anyway, but because of everything she was. The future spread before them like the endless ocean, unknown but no longer frightening. There would be Renaissance masterpieces in Florence, candlelit dinners in Rome, gondola rides through Venice. There would be quiet mornings reading together, fierce debates over classical philosophy, a lifetime of conversations with someone who valued her mind as much as her presence. Richard leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Ready for our adventure, my darling?" Anita turned to face him. This man who had crossed a ballroom floor and changed her entire world, and smiled with a joy she had once thought impossible. "I have been ready all my life," she said. And as the ship carried them toward Italy and everything that waited beyond, Richard pulled her close and kissed her again, there in the salt spray and sunlight, two people who had found each other against all odds and refused to let society's narrow vision define their worth. The English coast vanished into the horizon, and with it, the woman who had once believed herself unworthy of love. In her place stood the Duchess of Ashford, seen, valued, cherished, and finally completely, utterly free.